Well, good evening and welcome to the third of the Ian Ramsay Centre Seminars for Science and Religion at the Suter Room of Trinity College, Oxford, on the 15th of November 2012. Very pleased to welcome this evening Dr. Gregory Shushan, who's also a colleague at the Ian Ramsay Centre. And the title of the seminar is Near-Death Experience and the Origins of Afterlife Beliefs. Just to give you a bit of background, Dr. Shushan is the author of the Graumeyer award-nominated Conceptions of the Afterlife in Early Civilizations, Universalism, Constructivism and Near-Death Experience. He's been visiting lecturer in religious studies at the University of Wales, Lampeter, lecturer in the study of religions at University College Cork, where he helped to establish the first such department in the Republic of Ireland, guest lecturer in anthropology of religions at Swiss University, and research fellow at the Centro Incontri Umani, the cross-cultural centre at Ascona in Switzerland. He's presented his research in 7 different countries, is recipient of 6 academic awards, including the Gordon Child Prize. He holds a diploma in East Mediterranean Archaeology from Birkbeck College, University of London, a BA in Egyptian Archaeology, and an MA in Research Methods for the Humanities from University College London, and a PhD in Religious Studies from the University of Wales, Lampeter. He's currently a research fellow at the Ian Ramsay Centre here in Oxford, and he's researching comparative afterlife beliefs in indigenous religions worldwide in the context of shamanic and near-death experiences. This project is supported by a grant from the Perrott Warwick Fund, Trinity College, Cambridge. Would you please welcome Dr. Gregory Shushan? Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks everyone for coming here tonight. I'm assuming that everyone here has at least some passing awareness of near-death experience, considering the attention it receives both on popular fronts as well as in scholarly academic literature. But very briefly, near-death experiences, or NDEs as they're commonly abbreviated, are typically when individuals who are resuscitated from a period of clinical death or near death report that they spontaneously and temporarily left their bodies and had certain kinds of so-called mystical or spiritual experiences. It was only in 1975 that they were codified, popularized, and actually given the name near-death experience. This was by an American medical doctor and psychologist, Raymond Moody. But ostensibly, documentary reports of near-death experiences are known from essentially all times and from all around the world. These are just a few that I happen to know of coming from these times and places. Some of the main features of the near-death experience are out-of-body experiences and seeing one's body, seeing the dead body below as you've left your own body, entering darkness and emerging from darkness, meeting deceased relatives, encountering a being of light, some kind of evaluation of one's earthly life or some sort of judgment, reaching an obstacle or a barrier or a limit, or encountering a number of different obstacles and barriers, journeys to other realms, which are often seen as a return home or a return to the origin point, and finally feelings of oneness and association of the self with the divine or some kind of ultimate reality. Now, I'd like to stress that although there are these universal elements to near-death experiences, like any experience, they're obviously rooted in the cultural context of the individual. So they're processed, interpreted, and expressed in different ways depending on culture, religion, language, and so on. It's a symbiotic relationship in which culture-specific beliefs influence universal experiences and vice versa. So one way to look at it is the way the experience is experienced varies by individual. So in the West, for example, when the return to the body element, which is obviously universal, in the West, this is often because the person is told that it's not yet his or her time to die, so therefore they're sent back to the body. But in the East, it's often a case of mistaken identity, where the person is mistaken for somebody with the same name, and once the error is discovered, then that's when they're sent back to the body. But in both cases, obviously, it's a return to the body. Some elements also seem to correspond with social organization or scale of society. So, for example, only in small-scale societies do we have reports of walking along a road to the afterlife realm, or afterlife realms where it's actually situated in an earthly locale, like a volcano or a mountaintop or something like that. So one way to put it is that NDEs begin as cultural or non-cultural, as pre-cultural or non-cultural events, which cause cross-culturally specific but nevertheless comparable experiences. I know that's a very loaded argument, but I'm sticking with it for now. Accounts worldwide share certain common thematic elements which are embedded in a matrix of idiosyncratic material. Now, my own involvement in this area of research had its genesis in my Egyptological studies. I was reading some ancient Egyptian afterlife texts and noticed some parallels with near-death experiences, though in obviously very mythologized form. This top image is essentially a map of the other world from a text called the Book of Two Ways, and the bottom is a judgment scene from the so-called Book of the Dead. The parallels that I noticed with the near-death experience reminded me of a book I had read a few years earlier called Otherworld Journeys by Karol Zaleski. This was published in 1987. This was basically the first book to look in any sort of depth at the relationship between near-death experience and culture. The accounts that Zaleski discusses are ostensibly actual experiences of various medieval European religious figures, often monks, but they're also very much part of an established literary genre. The Egyptian funerary texts, on the other hand, are ritual texts with very little narrative structure and a great deal of very complex esoteric material relating to assisting the soul of the deceased to transition to the next realm and attain a positive state of being. So the question is, why should there be similarities between these medieval European texts, these ancient Egyptian texts, and modern near-death experiences? So I started wondering, to what degree are afterlife conceptions similar cross-culturally, and to what degree are they consistent with reports of near-death experiences? Because if consistent similarities were found cross-culturally, this would suggest that afterlife conceptions are not entirely culturally determined, and that they must have some kind of common, perhaps even universal foundation, such as the near-death experience. Now, to explore these problems, I needed to move away from an area studies orientation, Egyptology, and into cross-cultural comparison and the bigger theoretical problems that involves. So for my postgraduate work, I compared afterlife beliefs in ancient Egypt and ancient India in the context of near-death experiences. These two civilizations made an excellent test case because their earliest texts, which deal with afterlife beliefs, were written at times when there was literally no contact between the two and never had been. And this is Old and Middle Kingdom for Egypt and the Vedic period for India. Also, both of these civilizations emerged largely in a state of cultural independence. I won't say that they were pristine civilizations because that's an argument of, essentially there's no such thing of total cultural isolation, but high degree of cultural independence. They were linguistically unaffiliated, geographically distant, and probably had different types of social organization as well. Egypt was a territorial state society, and Vedic India was very likely not a centralized state society at all. So if I were to find similarities between the afterlife beliefs in these two very different, distinct, independent civilizations, they couldn't be explained by diffusion, meaning the traveling of ideas from one society to another as a result of cultural contact. And this is a very different approach than what Karol Zaleski did, comparing modern near-death experiences with medieval Christian near-death experiences. With medieval Christian accounts of otherworld journeys. It's very easy to argue that there would be some kind of cultural continuity between medieval Christians and the modern Western world, which, even if we're not Christian, all of us, is very much a Christian influenced society, especially when we have ideas about afterlife beliefs. So this is kind of limiting the idea that there's any cultural continuity and there can't be any sort of unbroken transmission of ideas like there might be from medieval Christianity to the modern West. So to further limit the possibility of intertextuality, which is one text or tradition borrowing from another, I restricted the text I looked at to the absolute earliest, those with no existing forebears or previous models from which they could have borrowed. For Egypt, the first religious text originated sometime around 2350 BCE, starting with the pyramid texts, and the earliest from India date to sometime before 1500 BCE, and possibly much, much earlier, starting with the Rig Veda. So I then expanded the sample even further, adding Sumerian and Old Babylonian Mesopotamia, going back to as early as 2100 BCE, pre-Buddhist China, going back to the 18th century BC, but most of that material is sort of beginning around 800, and also pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, mostly Aztec and Maya. And those civilizations, the earliest material was composed, believed to have been composed long before the Spanish conquest of 1521. Now, like Egypt and India, all of these civilizations are separated by vast geographical distances, vast chronological distances, and all developed with a very high degree of cultural independence from one another. So at the time when all the texts were written that I looked at, there literally was no known contact between any of these civilizations, with the exception, obviously, of the Aztec and Maya. And in addition to being cross-cultural, cross-temporal, and cross-geographical, the texts I compared were also cross-contextual, meaning that they originated in differing contexts and for differing purposes. Some afterlife descriptions are found in mythological texts or literary texts, some in funerary ritual texts, and some are found in hymns or poems, and then there are also guidebooks, which sort of instructional texts, which tell the deceased what to expect in the afterlife and how to go about attaining a positive experience there and ending up in a sort of happy, blissful state. There are also texts that are mostly about what life is like in this world, with only incidental material about the afterlife, such as the Confucian classics in China. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to learn all 7 languages which the texts were written in, but most of it was translated in good, reliable translations. Not ideal, but there you go. Then, modifying a system developed by the anthropologist Levi-Strauss, I found it useful to divide the descriptions of afterlife beliefs into 3 different elements: structure, mytheme, and symbol. So if a myth structure is a journey to an afterlife realm, it's the sort of overall structure of the myth is the journey, elements of the myth, such as ascent and judgment and encountering supernatural beings, would be mythemes within the structure. Symbols, in turn, make up these mythemes with culture-specific details. So the kinds of spirits that are being encountered, the mode of judgment, and the mode of ascent, how the person ascends to the other realm. So symbols are expressed in mythemes, and mythemes make up the structure. And these are in direct proportion to levels of similarities and differences. The fewest similarities occur on the symbolic level, the most similarities on the structural level, because nearly everybody has a journey to an afterlife myth. Well, a lot of people do. And the mytheme level is somewhere in between. That's because these are culture-specific symbols. This is a very cross-cultural idea of an afterlife myth, and these are the way that they're expressed. So the comparison revealed first that the similarities were far too consistent and too specific for coincidence to be an adequate explanation. And secondly, that frequently recurring thematic elements in the texts of each of these civilizations correspond directly to the most typical elements of the near-death experience. So to illustrate this, I've just listed a few symbolic expressions of these cross-cultural themes for each civilization. Obviously, it's impossible to sort of go through each and every similarity and difference in the time we have here. But just to give you some example, I'll run through each near-death experience element and show you how the belief in the text matches up to it. So, for example, out-of-body experiences. In reports of OBEs, individuals obviously describe ascending from the body, and this very much recalls repeated references in the text to ascent. Some describe souls ascending on their own cremation smoke in societies where they practice cremation, some on dragons, some on stairways or ladders, some as birds, and some simply as spirits. And of course, even when not explicitly described, an out-of-body experience is implied by the very concept of souls undergoing experiences after the death of their bodies. Then, encountering one's own corpse, seeing one's own body below as they rise up from it. This is very significant because of the meaning of this encounter. The meaning is cross-culturally consistent. It's often associated with the individual's realization that he or she must be dead, but is paradoxically still alive because they're seeing their own corpse. Their consciousness has been maintained after dying. So in other words, the realization of one's own physical death is also the realization of the conscious survival of that death. In Egypt, this occurs in a moment when the deceased discovers the corpse of the underworld god Osiris. But because the deceased actually becomes Osiris, this is actually an encounter with one's own corpse. And this encounter is explicitly, in the texts, characterized as a revelation of a secret. And it's this very secret which causes the true realization of death and immortality and actually enables the soul of the deceased to move on and progress to the next level in the afterlife. In a Mesopotamian myth, there's a god called Damu, and he discovers that beer is being made from the blood of his corpse, the congealed blood of his corpse. And it's hearing this news in his spirit form that makes him realize that he's dead. In the Indian texts, interestingly, out-of-body experiences are overt. They just state right out that there are people leaving their bodies and so on. But there are not corpse encounters that I've so far been able to discover. There are references to decay residing in the house infernal. And this, I think, is related to the idea that the seeds of rebirth and immortality are found within death and within the underworld. In China, the corpses of divinized humans are a recurring theme, and there is a corpse of an afterlife god who's described as holding the drug of immortality. In Mesoamerica, it's also very explicit. The feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl realizes he's dead when he sees his own corpse reflected in a mirror, and this very clearly facilitates his progression to divine rebirth. These descriptions of corpses are also very graphic, oftentimes. I won't go into detail there in case you've eaten recently. But this recalls the revulsion that near-death experiencers often feel when they see their body below them, and they have this horror of returning to it. And they think of it as this, sort of alien thing that they really don't want to go back to. Then we have entering darkness, as well as ascending. There are also descriptions of descending to underworlds, to dark caves, going through passageways, tunnels, and numerous references to darkness in general. We have meeting deceased relatives or ancestors, lots and lots of references to parents, brothers, sisters, unspecified ancestors, and sometimes friends or acquaintances, and occasionally even enemies. This is extremely common, unsurprisingly, because realms of the dead will obviously be populated with the previously deceased. Then we have a presence or being of light. When deities are described at all, they're almost always in these texts portrayed as radiating light. There are also sun gods and star gods that are prominent in each tradition, which obviously are beings of light. Spirits of deceased ancestors also frequently are described as beings of light or also as stars. And the other world itself is often said to be a realm of light, just a bright, bright place. Then there's judgment or some kind of conduct evaluation or moral assessment of one's earthly life. And this is normally assisted by a deity or some sort of council of judges. Interestingly here, there are also life reviews in some of these texts. Life review is a very common near-death experience phenomena in which individuals experience their whole life condensed into a very short time, or almost as if it's occurring, replaying all at once, literally life flashing before your eyes. And this is often accompanied by feelings of moral evaluation. There's an example of this in Egypt in a text called The Teaching for King Merikare, where the gods judge the king's entire life history, which unfolds in an hour, is how they describe it, and it's placed before him like a treasure, his entire life. In Mesopotamia, a dead man declares his sins before a god, and the deeds of the deceased hero Bilgamesh, who's the Sumerian version of Gilgamesh, his deeds are reviewed by a panel of gods as well before he proceeds to the next level. And in India, in the Upanishads, a life review is described just as in a typical NDE. Then we have reaching obstacles or barriers or limits, often bodies of water which can't be passed in the texts. There's also an interesting overlap here with the concept of judgment, because in every civilization, the spirit of the deceased is stopped on the way to the underworld or to the heavenly realm, either by an ancestor or a spirit or a god, and interrogated. The interrogation usually concerns the identity of the deceased. Over and over, all across the world, I've been reading, who are you, when they get to the afterlife realm? They're always asked this question. They're also often asked about the nature of the divine, the nature of their own true selves. So it's a case of understanding that the true self is a spiritual self, and also about details of the afterlife. So they should have some kind of foreknowledge of what to expect as they progress on their journey. Those who don't show this requisite knowledge are not allowed to pass. That very idea of not being allowed to pass that certain state recalls the return element of the near-death experience, where individuals are told either that it's not their time to die or that there's been a case of mistaken identity. It's after this point that they then return to the body. Then obviously there are journeys to other realms, in the sense that the afterlife realm is the true one, a return to the origin point, as Mircea Eliade puts it, or going home. That's also very common in near-death experiences. There are also multiple realms discussed. It's very rarely just two realms, as we often think of afterlife in the West, heaven and hell. It's more often a progression of experiences. And then finally, feelings of oneness involving the association or union of the self with the divine, or the absolute, or ultimate reality, or whatever sort of term you want to use. In most cases, the spirit of the deceased becomes one with a particular deity, or sometimes with particular deities simultaneously, this idea of omnipotence and omnipresence, though sometimes they will just simply transform into a discrete god or godlike entity themselves. And another intriguing parallel involves the after effects of near-death experiences. Many people who have these experiences claim that it gave them a new sense of meaning in their life, or a new sort of spiritual renewal. This is very much related to William James's idea of the fruits of religious experience. And this recalls the fact that the netherworld in all of these regions, in all of these traditions, is a place where one attains knowledge, and it's a place of rebirth. Now remember that all of these similarities that I've listed in these past few slides are, despite a lack of cultural continuity, a temporal separation of at least 850 years and up to more than 4,000 years, and despite the fundamental differences between various ancient mythological or otherwise instructional texts and modern reports of near-death experiences. So to me, the implication of that is that the authors of the texts were familiar with near-death experiences, and the origins of afterlife conceptions in these ancient civilizations are thus rooted in NDEs. And this reinforces the idea of a symbiotic relationship where culture-specific beliefs influence universal experiences and vice versa. Each culture has its own way of experiencing and expressing the NDE, but the NDE is always interpreted as an indication of what will happen when we die. I should say quasi-always, almost always. There are occasional people that will have them and doubt it later on, such as the famous Susan Blackmore. To argue the reverse, that the conceptions came before the experience, doesn't explain how a set of thematically consistent ideas could be independently invented worldwide, or how that set of ideas could influence the spontaneous, universal near-death experience. In other words, cross-cultural experience is explicable without pre-existing common belief, but cross-cultural belief is not explicable without common experience. Now, if you'd like to read more about that particular phase of my research, it's been published in this book. But this theory of religious beliefs lying in anomalous or religious experiences has a long, long pedigree, starting with E.B. Tyler, if not earlier. In 1871, Tyler wrote, "Men whose spirits, traveling in the hallucinations of extreme illness to the land of the dead, have returned to reanimate their bodies and tell what they have seen." And he argued that such experiences form the foundation of beliefs. And in 1898, Andrew Lang reached similar conclusions concerning the origins of religious and supernatural beliefs among so-called savages in light of similar experiences among living and educated civilized men. More recently, David Hufford has coined the term experiential source hypothesis for this kind of argument, which I think is a very useful term. He writes, "There are classes of experience that give rise to spiritual beliefs among practically all who have them, regardless of prior beliefs. The perception and interpretation of such experiences are similar among persons with very different backgrounds and expectations." And another sociologist, James McLennan, he writes that although wondrous events, which is his term for anomalous experience or religious experience, although these are part of a symbiotic process in which culture shapes narrative accounts and the accounts in turn affect experiential reports, the thematic elements in common with wondrous accounts have had an enormous impact on religious ideologies, contributing to cross-cultural convergences. These common features include belief in spirits, souls, heavens, and hells. So often when we have these kinds of arguments, it's accompanied by afterlife-related themes. But in the current postmodernist-influenced climate of the study of religions in contemporary times, such ideas are highly unpopular and actually regarded as being naive. The more widely accepted stance at the moment is that all experience is entirely culturally and linguistically created, not merely influenced by language and culture, but actually created by them. There is allegedly no distinction between an experience and a narrative describing an experience, so quite literally text and context are everything. This means that there can be no such thing as any sort of cross-cultural experience which we could call the same, and certainly no such thing as cross-cultural religious experience, because all religions and cultures are unique. It also means that religious beliefs cannot be grounded on religious experiences because, of course, language and culture precede experience, and, of course, because there's no such thing as religious experience. It's a very circular argument. Not only are these anti-realist viewpoints, but to my way of thinking, they're anti-scientific. And I think they're rooted in a series of unsubstantiated assumptions. According to this way of thinking, my conclusions here, and the evidence that I've used to support them, and Hufford's and McLennan's and everyone else, simply cannot be, because they don't fit into these particular socially historical situated paradigms, philosophical paradigms, that these postmodernist-influenced speakers have outlined. So it's basically the argument is, it can't be, therefore it isn't. Now, I obviously don't have time to go into all that, the theoretical and methodological problems, but I do have an article coming in this journal if you happen to be keenly interested in the ins and outs of that particular debate. I don't have an issue number or month yet, but it's forthcoming. For now, though, I'll give you one example. Going back to Karol Zaleski's book, Otherworld Journeys, which I mentioned earlier, Zaleski went to great lengths to make the connection between the medieval otherworld journey accounts that she wrote about and near-death experiences. She took a lot of time demonstrating numerous similarities between the different narratives and wrote an entire book about it, only to essentially ignore them, and then conclude that NDEs are, quote, through and through works of the socially conditioned religious imagination. This kind of reasoning also has a long pedigree. I mentioned Tyler. Despite his apparent support for the experiential source hypothesis and his acknowledging near-death experience before that was even a term, he also stated that anomalous experiences are entirely due to individual and cultural expectation, which is, to me, a total contradiction to saying that beliefs can be rooted in these experiences, as well as ignoring the significance of the similarities that he himself pointed out. So in any case, despite my arguments supporting this experiential source hypothesis, I'm also an advocate of theoretical eclecticism. And this is evaluating the abilities of various theories to explain the data. I think sometimes so-called competing theories are not mutually exclusive at all, though people often present them as such. And I would even argue that a really compelling, comprehensive explanation that addresses both differences and similarities actually requires a combination of factors. So, for example, psychological factors, common descriptions of the other world being a realm of abundance, sort of happy hunting grounds. These kind of ideas likely reflect genuine earthly anxieties about having enough to eat, or a Freudian wish fulfillment fantasy of a life of opulence and abundance as a reward for surviving a life of struggle and want. There are also social and political factors. For example, ideas of judgment are very clearly manipulated by the ruling elite in most of these civilizations, and that results in increasingly detailed descriptions of morally determined afterlives as time goes on in each civilization. So much more detailed descriptions of heavens and hells. There are also environmental factors. For example, the afterlife generally reflects earthly social structures, social hierarchies, and the local environment as well. So often the other world is a mirror image of this world. And in addition to providing a well of symbols with which to express ideas, feelings, or longings, any culture will also impose limitations on that expression. There are also ritual factors. It might be that ideas of afterlife realms being below the earth reflect burial, and ideas of afterlife realms being above the earth reflect cremation rituals. Although that's complicated because heavens and hells exist in cremation and burial societies. But there still could be some kind of ritual connection there in the way it's expressed. And there are also factors involving cognition and conceptual logic. As biologically universal humans, this is just simply the way we think about some of these things. So an example is the way ideas of rebirth and spiritual renewal are commonly expressed in terms of the natural world, the cycles of nature or the cycles of the sun and stars and the moon. That probably just reflects understandings of the role, the place of the human being in relation to the rest of nature, in relation to the cycles of nature. And then personal perspective and interpretation also undoubtedly play a part. I think in a lot of theories, people tend to forget that the people who wrote these texts were individuals with their own histories and ideas and innovations and baggage and things. One elephant in the room in this kind of research is the question of whether or not there is actually an afterlife. And this is a question that's almost always asked in this kind of research. Well, I stake no claim either way, but I think that in light of this theoretical eclecticism that I'm advocating, looking at metaphysical and philosophical interpretations is only methodologically fair. I don't think we should automatically discount the possibility of a genuine metaphysical element just because it doesn't fit into current Western scientific worldviews. And moreover, there have been numerous claims of anomalous information retrieval in reports of near-death experiences, and I don't think these can be easily dismissed. Things like allegedly veridical observations while outside the body, seeing what's going on in the operating theater while technically brain dead, things like this, as well as clairvoyance and precognition. I'm not in a position to evaluate or judge all these testimonies, but I don't think we can lightly dismiss them either. In fact, those kinds of reports of clairvoyance and these observations while out of the body also are universal elements in themselves, or appear to be. And these kinds of experiences often convince the person who had the near-death experience that it was real, that it was a genuine experience of leaving the body and going to another realm. But either way, ultimately, the experiential source hypothesis itself makes no commitment to either metaphysical or reductionist theories. That really all depends on how you look at the NDE itself, whether you believe that it's a genuine spiritual experience or just epiphenomena of a dying brain, or of a reviving brain, as some people might have it as well. This brings us to my current work in progress, not the reviving brain, but these conclusions. I'm now looking at afterlife beliefs in relation to shamanic and other and near-death experiences in indigenous societies around the world. Now, there are wide differences between the early civilizations I looked at earlier and the mostly small-scale societies that I'm looking at now. There's different scale, obviously, as well as very different social organization in almost all cases. So looking at these kinds of societies is essential in further testing my previous conclusions. So if I find the same kinds of similarities between these indigenous societies and these early civilizations, that strengthens the argument that both experiences and beliefs are at least partly determined by something other than entirely social or cultural or linguistic factors. These are some of the most problematic, yet some of the most significant questions in the study of religious experience in general. Their role in the formation of religious beliefs, the relationship between anomalous experience and cultural expectation, the social and cultural factors which determine how experience interacts with belief, and finally, the intelligibility or otherwise of philosophical theories of an actual afterlife in light of religious diversity and difference. Adding further complexity to this already complex mix, sometimes there are broadly thematic cross-cultural similarities between accounts of shamanic experiences of journeys to other realms. And these, in turn, sometimes correspond with the most common elements of the near-death experience. Like NDEs, in certain shamanic practices, it's alleged that the consciousness of the individual temporarily leaves the body and travels to other realms. But unlike the NDE, in shamanism, this is done deliberately in order to gain knowledge or to retrieve the soul of an individual who is in danger of death. Shamanic practices also vary widely. There are many different methods used by shamans to achieve the trance states in which these kinds of experiences occur. Drumming, dancing, chanting, various types of drug use. This is just an image of a shaman of the Sitka people of Alaska and the Altai of southern Siberia. So unlike the spontaneous near-death experience, shamanic journeys are deliberately induced. They're generally not taking place in a life-threatening circumstance, and they are overall far more culturally embedded for those reasons, occurring in a very specific, culture-specific ritual context. So again, why would typical near-death experience features sometimes be reported in shamanic experiences? Before looking at possible answers to that question and others, I'll just look a little bit about how I'm going about addressing these questions. Consistent with my work on the ancient civilizations, I'm trying to minimize the possibility of diffusion as an explanation for cross-cultural similarities. So I'm limiting the societies I'm looking at to ones which have not converted to any non-indigenous religion. So Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on. And I'm limiting them to societies which are unrelated to the early civilizations I looked at before. So, for example, the modern Maya will be excluded because, for one thing, the religion is very much incorporating elements of Christianity, and also because I looked at the ancient Maya before, so if there are similarities there, that's not going to surprise anyone. Now, the sources I'm using are the earliest documents which describe religious beliefs and experiences in these societies. So it's an ethno-historical study. This, of course, raises some methodological concerns. Because all these societies are non-literate, I have to rely on the reports of missionaries and explorers beginning in the 16th century, and materials written or compiled by Western ethnographers beginning in the 19th century. All this data has therefore been filtered through the lenses of many individuals who have varying ideologies, varying biases, ethnographic skills, linguistic skills, and powers of insight, and powers of interpretation, and those kinds of things. And furthermore, the indigenous informants themselves may have modified or even invented accounts of their beliefs, particularly when speaking to interviewers with either an overtly evangelical stance or those in a position of political dominance. So it's important to remember when looking at indigenous societies and their religions that they were generally first studied during periods of crisis, a religious, cultural, social, and physical crisis. Their land and resources were being exploited or stolen by foreign powers, and very vigorous attempts were being made to civilize them, which partly meant the destruction or at least transformation of their indigenous beliefs. But despite all these problems that I've just run through, I think that limiting my sample to unconverted societies is really the only way to at least limit the possibility of diffusion of ideas between these cultures. For a variety of theoretical and methodological reasons, the cross-cultural comparison of religions has been highly criticized, again, largely from postmodernist-influenced thinkers. I address these at some length in my book, but for now I'll just mention two that are the most relevant here. The first is the problem of unfounded generalizations. That's making sweeping statements about religions based on inadequate sample sizes. So, for example, if you were to claim that all religions believe in afterlife judgment, but in fact you've only looked at 4 or 5, you can't really generalize about the entire world that way. The second problem is decontextualization, which is extracting religious beliefs from their religious and cultural situations, looking at them out of context of their overall society and history. So to preempt these kinds of criticisms or address them, I'm integrating both quantitative and qualitative approaches. Quantitatively, I'm using Yale University's online Human Relations Area Files World Cultures Database, also known as HRAF. This is a collection of cross-cultural ethnographic materials representing over 400 societies, selected on the basis of quality as well as by range of geographic diversity and cultural diversity. So after applying the criteria I've mentioned earlier, only looking at pre-converted societies or non-converted societies, I have a sample size of about 30, which I'm searching in this database, using their categories of eschatological beliefs, shamanism, journeys to other worlds, religious experience, death and dying, and so on. Qualitatively, I'm considering some specific shamanic and NDE narratives in relation to the socio-historical, cultural, religious contexts of the societies in which they're found. So a sort of closer engagement with some of the societies on a more qualitative level. and then comparing the beliefs and experiences in each region, integrating the quantitative and qualitative sections to highlight the most recurrent themes and the most significant differences, and then analyzing the results with the interdisciplinary, theoretically eclectic approach that I described earlier, testing and evaluating these various theories and combining them to come up with a comprehensive theory made up of the most compelling elements of each of these theories. So let's have a look at a couple of examples of the type of material that I'm dealing with. First, the afterlife beliefs of the Manu-Alu people of the Western Solomon Islands in the Pacific, as reported in fieldwork done in 1908 to 1909. They believe that the soul leaves the body at death and then either ascends to the afterlife realm or walks there along a road. The deceased is met by a warden and interrogated. And if the person is deemed to be good, he or she gives the warden beads or shells and is then allowed to pass and is told which is the best path to take. But if the person is bad, they're led on a path of pigs and dogs to either get lost or delayed or eaten by the pigs and dogs and suffer a second death or annihilation. There are also a number of intermediate places, including these local sacred earthly locations, such as volcanoes and islands. The deceased is also met by ancestors who ask, "Who are you?" again interrogated, and the deceased must give his or her identity and clan affiliation before being welcomed, bathed, fed, and massaged in order to repair the body. Only then can the dead, is the dead allowed to stay in an idealized mirror image of Earth, working in gardens, dancing, getting married, procreating, visiting other islands, or even relocating to other islands, but always remaining invisible to the living. Now, interestingly, the Manu-Alu people related two return from death narratives. The distinction there is that they didn't give details of the near-death experience, but they have tales of somebody who died and came back to life. So they do have this tradition, at least to some extent. And they also believe that when a corpse returns to life, it's because that they were assessed in the other world and sent back. They also believed in out-of-body travel during shamanic experiences. Now, 8,400 miles away, across an entire ocean, across an entire continent, and more than 3 centuries earlier, on the first voyage to Virginia, Thomas Harriot reported the first known Native American NDEs in 1585. This is an image from the illustration from that text. His informants were Algonquin Indians who gave accounts of men who had died, then revived to tell of their experiences. The first man was a wicked man who went to a hellish place, but was saved by a god who made him return to his body in order to teach his people about how to avoid such negative fates. So in other words, teach them righteous living to ensure a positive afterlife. The second man went to a more positive realm, a place of abundance, an idealized mirror image of Earth once again, and there he met his deceased father, who sent him back to his body to tell people about the happiness in the other realm. These narratives are particularly important because they were told by natives in support of their statements about their afterlife beliefs. Now, across yet an entirely different ocean and a different continent, and almost 350 years later, we have a 1920s narrative from the Mbuti Pygmies of the Ituri rainforest in the Congo. These are people who are particularly resistant to outside influence. According to a local shamanic-type figure, after death, the soul left the body and was surrounded by spirits. These spirits would pounce on the deceased and throw the wicked into the fire, which burns somewhere in the bowels of the earth. But the good would go to live with the creator god, Mungu, who looked like a man, though was also identified with rainbows and snakes. When asked how they know about the afterlife, the Mbuti informants replied that the knowledge comes from previous shamans. They don't explicitly say that it's because the shamans had been to this other realm, but I think there's some kind of implication is there. So, what does all this add up to? only my work on native North America is complete. Africa is almost complete, so I can only offer preliminary conclusions based on these two continents. Now, native North America turned out to be a virtual model of the arguments from my previous book, that NDEs are universal, though filtered through individual and cultural layers, that they are almost always interpreted in metaphysical terms, and commonly form the basis for afterlife beliefs cross-culturally. Before I undertook this research, there were maybe 10 or 12 near-death experiences identified as such in small-scale societies. So put that in the perspective of the fact that I found 50 or 60 in North America alone. And these are ostensibly historical NDEs that were said to happen to particular individuals and often in living memory. These also occur across the continent, dating from the 16th century, as we saw, to the early 20th century, and does not include the return from death narratives where details aren't given, and does not include what seem to be mythologized narratives of afterlife journeys, mythologized NDEs, essentially. And I also found multiple overt indigenous statements in North America, again spanning the entire continent, that local afterlife beliefs originated in NDEs. Again, they didn't have this term NDE in this ethnographic material, but what they're describing is an NDE. So, for example, according to the French missionary Chrétien Leclerc in 1691, the Micmac natives of the Gulf of St. Lawrence and Nova Scotia based their afterlife beliefs on a particular NDE of a prominent member of society. This man had apparently been dead for a long time, then revived and told of his journey to the land of souls. He met the ruler of this realm, who allowed him to return to earth to tell his people about the other world and to bring them certain fruits, which is a very interesting literal parallel with William James. This man's testimony was taken by his people as, quote, indubitable truth, and was more than enough to persuade them that souls, after departure from their bodies, had a place to which they went to remain. Now, significantly, this testimony directly inspired other members of this tribe to attempt to undergo a similar journey through shamanic practices. This shows that NDEs and shamanic journeys were seen as comparable types of experiences with similar meanings. It also suggests that afterlife beliefs, which were rooted in near-death experiences, were subsequently validated, perpetuated, and likely elaborated upon through attempts at replication through personal shamanic experiences. And in disbelief, Leclerc reiterated that such experiences, and only such experiences, he says, are responsible for the indigenous beliefs in the soul and afterlife. In addition to the Micmac and Algonquin examples I gave, all these tribes stated that their afterlife beliefs derived from these types of experiences. This replicates the findings of certain anthropologists who discovered that Native American afterlife mythology and ideas about the soul were rooted in experiences such as NDEs and shamanic journeys. For example, Oka Holtkrantz wrote, "The Native American Orpheus tradition has been inspired by religious experiences, and these basic experiences have been constantly renewed within the frame of religious life." And Irving Hallowell, "Aboriginal beliefs in the reality of a life beyond the grave cannot be viewed as simple dogmas that gain currency without any appeal to observation and experience. Specific individuals are referred to whose historicity is not in question. When I made inquiries about life after death, it was the alleged experiences of these individuals that were first mentioned." Similar statements were made by the ethnographer and psychologist Holger Koweit. When asked about the origins of their knowledge of the beyond, the members of various cultures say they gained the knowledge from experiences of those who have returned, near-death experiencers, and from shamans. And in his survey of 67 small-scale societies worldwide, Dean Shields found that 95% of them believed in out-of-body experiences. And he concluded, when very different cultures at very different times and in different places arrive at the same or very similar out-of-body belief, we begin to wonder if this results from a common experience of this happening. But not quite so fast. Africa appears to present a nearly opposite model to Native America, raising some important challenges to these kinds of generalizations. So while Shields' statement about OBEs does apply to Africa, the same can't be said of NDEs or even afterlife beliefs per se. Generally speaking, African cultures are far less concerned about the afterlife. Mythological narratives of underworld journeys and heavenly ascents are rare, and shamanic otherworld journeys and accounts of near-death experiences are even more so. Obviously, there's a great diversity of cultures and beliefs across Africa, but it does seem that there are some regional tendencies, some distinctively African cultural idiosyncrasies which simply are not present in native North America. African religions, by and large, are far more focused on the continued presence of ancestor spirits on Earth, and with avoiding potentially harmful influences from them. Their shamanic-type practices mainly concern spirit possession and witchcraft, rather than soul travel, and their attitudes towards the dead are often characterized by high degrees of fear and avoidance. Interestingly, of the comparatively few African NDEs I've found, 8 or 10, almost all of them are from Bantu-speaking cultures, outlined in beige on this map. And this corresponds with the fact that Bantu cultures also tend to be slightly more concerned with the afterlife and sometimes have more detailed afterlife myths or more detailed beliefs about the afterlife. And in contrast to these multiple Native American statements that beliefs were based on near-death experiences, in Africa we have 2. And both of these are Bantu societies. These are also very clearly the exceptions that prove the rule. Most African near-death experiences, Bantu or otherwise, were related in contexts of suspicion and aberration. So, for example, a somewhat gruesome report from 1874, an Ashanti woman was killed for a funerary ritual sacrifice, but she revived, found herself naked and surrounded by the corpses of other sacrificial victims. So she went to the Council of Elders to explain to them that she had been to the land of the dead, but that she had been sent back because she was naked. So she requested of the Council of Elders that she be killed again after being properly clothed, and they duly obliged. In 1880, the Tanala of Madagascar, who were of East African origin, if an apparently dead person revived, he or she would immediately be stoned to death. Likewise, in 1875, a Zulu near-death experiencer was almost killed again on suspicion that he had been revived by witches. In 1931, it was reported that the Lamba of West Africa believed that people who allegedly returned from death were actually possessed by spirits, spirit possession being a more culturally acceptable explanation. And the Igbo people of Nigeria were said to have a deep-seated terror of disembodiment, according to a report from 1906. And in addition to these examples, certain funerary practices might also have contributed to the scarcity of African NDE reports. For example, as reported in 1904, the Lotse of southern Africa conducted burial immediately after death when the corpse was still warm, so not really giving anyone a chance to report a near-death experience. And also in many African societies, the elderly would be abandoned out of earshot of the village, essentially to die of starvation and to be eaten by animals. There are also repeated statements of fear of dead bodies, and presumably fear of a reanimated dead body would be even greater than fear of just a regular dead body. Even where we do have a return from death context for the founding of an African religious movement, which we do, that experience is secondary. In 1704, this Congolese prophet started an African new religious movement called Antonianism. She had a return from death experience. I hesitate to call it a near-death experience because when she returned from her apparent death, she didn't describe anything like an NDE, at least one wasn't recorded. Instead, the significant event was that she claimed to be possessed by Saint Anthony. And it was this possession upon which she founded the Antonian movement. Again, possession is apparently a more culturally acceptable phenomena than the disembodied adventures of a spirit or of reviving corpses. So when we look at the local socio-religious context surrounding belief in life after death, it's perhaps not so surprising that NDEs would be rare in African societies. It seems that there were often cultural restrictions on the valorization of such experiences, and apparently even on relating them, or possibly even having them. There was rarely a receptive environment for them to ever become part of tradition. And this contrasts sharply with North America, where long traditions of shamanic and visionary practices would undoubtedly mean greater cultural receptivity to near-death experiences. So to summarize and conclude, while NDEs are universal and people commonly base certain religious beliefs on them, they do so only when their cultural environment allows, unless, of course, they're innovating away from established tradition. Existing afterlife beliefs don't make near-death experiences more or less likely to happen, but more or less likely to be expressed. And as for shamanism, despite similarities with the NDE in certain cases, considering its ritual and cultural context, so far I'm not convinced that there's such a thing as a truly universal shamanic experience. As we've seen in at least some Native American cultures, shamanic practices are intended to actually replicate the near-death experience. So the NDE seems to act as a model, at least in shamanic societies, because it proves that such experiences are possible, also provides a roadmap for the shaman to negotiate his or her culturally situated shamanic journey. And of course, in that context, it's important to remember that these Native American religious revitalization movements of the 19th century, such as the Ghost Dance and the Indian Shaker Church, these were grounded explicitly in the authority of both ostensibly original near-death experiences of their founders and also in the subsequently deliberately sought near-death shamanic visionary experiences of the followers, again trying to replicate the original NDE of the founder. Almost everyone who's had an NDE genuinely believes that they temporarily left their bodies, encountered other beings, went to another realm, and so on. These are all people who have had near-death experiences. It's understandable that they would interpret that experience as exactly what it appears to be, phenomenologically speaking, and henceforth believe that consciousness survives bodily death. There are numerous examples of NDEs which run contrary to local or personal beliefs, demonstrating that these experiences are not predicated on cultural expectation. The African cases I gave are good examples, as is A.J. Ayers. NDEs often lead to a reorientation of spiritual or religious beliefs, including among lifelong atheists. These are effectively microcosms of the experiential source hypothesis. We also interestingly have various New Age support groups which are dedicated entirely to NDEs. And these can be seen, I think, as a new type of religiosity, with members of these groups seeking to renegotiate their spirituality in light of the near-death experience that they had. So, as well as afterlife conceptions per se, I think the NDE is relevant to other types of religious beliefs. An out-of-body experience would obviously be pretty compelling personal evidence for dualism. Judgment and life review concern ideals of righteous behavior, however righteous behavior is culturally constructed. And beliefs about deities and other kinds of supernatural entities might reflect encountering beings of light. So going beyond just specifically afterlife beliefs, I think that looking at these kinds of experiences for the origins of religious beliefs, generally speaking, is a fruitful avenue of research, and one which still has quite a lot of work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Shushan. We have up to half an hour for questions. I'm going to invite my colleague, Dr. Silva, to carry the microphone round. If you could just wait until the microphone gets to you before asking a question. Thank you.
Thanks for that exploration.
Thank you.
I don't want to quote you, but you're really basing a lot of your argument on the fact that there are sets of independent ideas in different cultures, and also that there is a lack of cultural cross-fertilization. And you mentioned 2,000 miles or 300 years. But of course, there is one universalizing principle, and that's the human brain, because despite those distances or times, which in terms of evolution are minuscule, we've all, as it were, come out of Africa. So that there is a brain which has not mutated much in a few thousand years, which with cultural input can sort of get round to producing these kinds of events. So that was one observation. What do you think about the brain contributing to these as a universal principle? And the second thing, you haven't mentioned anything about children, and I should be interested to hear what happens with children. So those are two for a starter anyway. I'll be back later.
The first one, I did mention in my the theoretically eclectic slide there that cognition and conceptual logic were definitely factors, I think, in the explaining some of the cross-cultural similarities, and saying that the brain, processes and negotiates some of these ideas in similar ways across the world, such as relating journeys to the afterlife and returning to the cycles of the sun or cycles of nature, that sort of thing.
More than just cognitive input, isn't it?
Well,
Cerebrally.
possibly. I mean, if you're also suggesting a sort of out of Africa grand diffusionism of these Aboriginal ideas.
No, just that the brain has
sort of
emerged from that, and despite the couple of thousand years here or there, or whatever miles, that's of little relevance to the evolutionary trajectory of the brain.
Sure.
Therefore, as an organ that can contribute to these ideas. Presumably these people haven't died, otherwise they have to come back and tell us that they've gone through these experiences.
Right.
And a dying brain doesn't put down memories.
Well, that's when you sort of get into ideas of does dying external consciousness retain memories, but that's kind of beyond the scope. But no, I agree that there are probably hardwired cognitive conceptual factors involved. But I think whether you want to say that those are the things that are responsible for the near-death experience, again, that's fine. But I don't think you can dismiss the fact that the near-death experience itself is a factor in these kinds of beliefs.
Oh no,
Okay.
That's very different. Yes.
Okay.
I wouldn't want to pull the rug out from that kind of statement.
Okay.
What about children?
Oh, children. I haven't looked a lot into NDEs in children, but I do know that they tend to be, from what I understand, that they tend to be very similar to the NDEs of everyone else. I read in a book by Carolyn Franks Davis about religious experience, not specifically about NDEs, but she was talking about children who have encounters with God. They will actually say they have one God for the church and one God that they experienced. So it's kind of independent from the cultural background that they're situated in. So.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Thanks.
Do you think we can assume that across all of these civilizations and the more recent societies that you've looked at, that the concept of the material body is universal? Because obviously we're using that as a reference point for interpreting concepts of out-of-body experiences.
That's a really good question, especially when we have reports that they were walking down a road or that they went to some earthly kind of realm. So I'm not sure if the way the person having the experience would really make a distinction between me or me outside my body or me as a body. But obviously the people around that person are going to notice that the person is evidently dead and coming back. So there's an observational aspect, I think, to it that you can see there's a different, I think everybody will make a distinction between a dead person and a living one. But the person actually having the experience, yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. Because sometimes they do actually say, they talk about, the body being massaged and bathed and all these kinds of things. So.
To what extent are sort of neurological explanations almost sort of sufficient to explain these things? I mean, I think I've seen some documentary at some stage where it showed that there was a release of endorphins and serotonin near to death as a sort of pain relief type thing, and to what extent does that explain a lot of these experiences? Would you say?
Well, in a way, that's a sort of separate issue. That's either if we accept that near-death experiences are influencing these beliefs, which is so my general thesis, then the question beyond that is what is the near-death experience, which is again not something I'm quite willing to take a stance either way. But yeah, there definitely have been those kinds of arguments, but there have also been pretty cogent arguments the other way, with things like people claiming that some of these experiences happen when the person is actually brain dead, when their body temperature is lowered, to the point where they couldn't possibly survive, and that the experience happened during that particular time, as well as the fact that none of these apparently physical causes will result in all of the phenomena that a near-death experiencer reports. So, well, I'm not dismissing that there are neurological factors. I don't think that a entirely compelling argument has been made to prove that. So.
I'm sorry, I just had to go out. I was afraid I was going to have a near-death experience because I was a bit overheated. But so I don't know if this point's been covered, but I was thinking of the déjà vu experience while you were speaking. And is there a sort of any similarity? Because that's a physiological thing about nearly falling asleep and just wondering what your comment would.
No idea, actually. No, I mean, I'd be interested to read more about that. So déjà vu is said to be a physical.
Linked with falling asleep, and not quite falling asleep, and the memory sort of says, "Oh, I've been here before," and it often happens when people aren't quite awake as well.
Okay, I know sleep paralysis. David Hufford has done a lot of research on that, and that's actually where he got his experiential source hypothesis from, concluding that all around the world people have these experiences of feeling immobilized in a sort of between sleeping and waking state, hypnagogic state, feeling immobilized and that there's a pressure on your chest and terrified. A lot of people have had this experience, but they interpret it culturally. So I think, I can't remember which locations he was talking about, but Newfoundland maybe was, they had an old hag tradition, and somewhere else it was some other kind of ghost or spirit. And there's a lot of speculation that alien abduction is the same thing, actually, is based on sleep paralysis. So it's a kind of related issue anyway.
Thank you. Oh, just on the neurological point, I did hear once about how as you're dying, you're in a strange condition, you're not breathing, your brain is oxygen starved, and you start to get abnormal sort of waves of activity that get bouncing around that could potentially contribute to what your cause for some of the experiences. But anyway, it's very interesting, the shamanism where people are trying to deliberately experience NDEs. I was wondering though, whether you get similar reports of self-induced NDEs from monks, priests in sort of the big religions, people who pray or meditate. Do you get the same kind of effects from that?
Yeah, I mean, there are reports in things like the Tibetan texts and some of the Vedic literature that seem to be kind of shamanically rooted, that describe similar kinds of things. I haven't looked into the Tibetan material much at all. But as far as the ancient civilizations I've looked at, it's probably only India that would have, in China, they have very overt shamanic context for these kinds of
But
things.
even more recently, such as say in Christianity, for example, do you get these kinds of experiences reported from?
I don't know actually. Just haven't.
Medieval ones in fasting monks.
That's right. Yeah, the medieval.
Fasting is a great cause of these phenomena in young people.
And I know there are Islamic texts. I think it's. I won't even say what I think it is because I'm probably totally wrong. But I know there's some Islamic afterlife text which seems to possibly be based on experience as well. But yeah, I guess Karol Zaleski's book is a lot about these. Would be in that context.
Thank you. I know that is not the object of your talk today, but this is what I wanted to say. If you enlarge a little bit the context. So if we enlarge the context to Christianity, for example, or to Buddhism even, to Judaism, a lot of people believe in afterlife without having any of this experience. I think statistically it's rather what I say. It's rather the other way around. Why?
So you want to repeat the question again?
Okay. The question is why people have beliefs in an afterlife who have not had near-death experiences.
Yeah, most of the people are in that category, I think. And the other one, before I forget, is that enough for neuron-related phenomenon to reorientate somebody's life altogether?
Yes, I think so. that one, I think it is. Just because of the evidence, people, come back from this experience claiming to be entirely changed. People around them notice differences in them. They'll be kinder. They often will go into charity work, or they just always come back as a more spiritual person. So whether, you're saying that if it's a strictly neurological thing, would that happen?
Yeah, it's too simple. It's too simple. I don't know.
Maybe. But as far as your first question goes, I think it's just because most people are reading the texts that that were based on these experiences. So I'm not saying that, every Egyptian person or whatever had a near-death experience and that's why they believed in an afterlife. Only that the people who wrote the texts at least heard about them or had them themselves. And because they wrote it down and established the religious tradition, it's followed by the rest of society.
Lazarus didn't write anything, didn't say anything when he came back. It's not recorded anywhere.
Who? Sorry?
Lazarus.
No, I'm not saying that. Well, I mean, in the Egyptian text, nobody said it either. So I should clarify if that wasn't clear that in a lot of the ancient texts, I was drawing parallels between the beliefs and the near-death experience. There weren't only in like sort of China and India where there are overt statements about the link between belief and experience. So I'm drawing these conclusions to explain the similarities cross-culturally.
My point is that I think we have something inside us which tells us, I don't know how to put it in words, but which alert us to an afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of mechanism, something, I don't know.
Yeah, and then lady there.
I think it was like slightly touched on before, the idea that I know you tried to limit cultural diffusion, but perhaps that the similarity of beliefs comes from the fact that we were all at one point a homogeneous culture that spread out, and maybe that the similarity could be due to that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's oh. Sorry. I'm glad it wasn't something more embarrassing than that. It's my wife. Oh, so yes, I think that's possible. There's a scholar in America, Michael Winkelmann, who argues essentially that there's this sort of shamanic culture based in experience, and that it could be that. But I think there's the problem of why are the beliefs correspond so closely to the experiences? So,
I mean, surely we don't retain other homogeneous things. So why could it just be this one aspect of culture?
Right, and there's no we don't have the same gods and other rituals and all these other beliefs from primordial Africa. So, yeah, and that's the same reason why I think diffusion between all these other civilizations is a non-starter.
Sure.
Thank you. Well, I will nail my colours to the mast and say I'm a confirmed metaphysicalist.
Okay.
I might be the only one here tonight to say that, and I don't care. I think, I first of all would like to thank you for the work you've done, and I think it's really illuminating.
Thanks.
And the care that you've taken to separate the different societies in time and geography, etc., I think is great, and I think we can learn a lot from that. So thank you for that. Just to say about some of the arguments which come up about the brain and chemical changes, etc., it's completely spurious. Anybody who reads the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences will be able to see the evidence as to why those theories are not true, and more recently, Consciousness Beyond Life by Pim van Lommel, very cogently argued with all the scientific references you could wish for. So I'd recommend anybody look at those texts if you're interested in delving into this further. But my question to you now is about the particular discovery that was made in Turkey recently, was on the news, I think in the last 6 months or so, and they were saying very early on, I mean it's going back about 10,000 years or so, they had found some archaeological evidence which suggested that afterlife beliefs came first and religious structure came second. I can't recall, unfortunately, the details of that. I was just wondering, was that something that you were aware of? Because it was significant for me to see this reported in the mainstream media.
No, I'm not aware of it actually, but I'll check. I mean, a lot of times people will say there are afterlife beliefs because they've found a certain kind of burial or a certain kind of grave goods given to the deceased, but that's not always an indicator of belief in an afterlife. There's Peter Ucko at Institute of Archaeology in London did a pretty well-known study where he looked at a lot of, I think mostly small-scale societies and their burial practices, and sometimes they would put, something like a broken sword to, keep the spirit from coming back. Or so, grave goods and position of bodies don't always indicate. So I'd be interested to see what they're basing that claim on.
Yeah, just a very quick question.
I'm sorry, I have three, but three interactive questions because speaking about near-death experience, who are we to find out if a near-death experience is a near-death experience? It could be a state of coma when people experience something like to do with, like you say, speaking about culture, something in the culture and the memory or something of their experience of life. And the other question is, when you speak about cross-culture or what people experience because they actually belong to a kind of ethnicity, it makes me think that there is a kind of subjectivity because there is this kind of, okay, most of them have a kind of divine light experience after death, which is more objective, but there is some of them will, you said, will have something to do with their culture. Then the question I'm asking, and because I'm quite confused now, is how do we define religion, or at least how do you define faith? Or how would we define God? If each person, each culture have their own God, it makes me think, I'm very confused about finding out, just because someone is different to me, is not a Christian, or is Buddhist, or Muslim, or someone coming from Judaism, it doesn't imply that because those people are coming from different religious backgrounds or different cultures, that God will be just different for them after life. It makes me think that God is just different after life. God is one God, regardless culture and regardless also experiences of life. So could you give me some idea of that, because I'm quite confused about that.
That's one argument, the common core of all religions. That's one philosophical argument that people have. But I'm
because one very last thing, you say that most of them will experience something like a divine, and the outcome is that they come back to life and they are better. This is good because I'm a Christian, I'm a Catholic, and I'm proud to say that. And what I heard about this near-death experience is those people, they come back, they experience actually purgatory, hell or heaven, and they come back to say to other people on earth that first, this is a reality, objective reality, is not. And then also that people should behave better. Then, in a way, it's a little what you're saying, but it's make God more like an objective God, which is a God of everybody, not a God of different culture. Thank you.
Right. Sorry, Dad, take it short. Do you want to respond at all?
Well, I mean, yes, that is, as I said, a philosophical argument that people have, that there's one God that's being accessed by all the different religions, and if indeed a being of light is described the same in all different religions, then and then a cultural ascription is then made, then that could support that argument. But that's a sort of taking a huge theological step from what I'm actually doing at a big, yeah.
I'll just make one brief comment of a quick question myself, because it's with regard to comment. You said something about that many of these experiences are very diverse in terms of the afterlives and afterlives. And what's interesting, that there's a sort of modern Christian conception of a binary state.
Right.
That if you go back to the Middle Ages, those binary options were themselves subdivided into many diverse manifestations. So there's something like Dante, of course. So hell is a very varied state, as well as, and also heaven is also very, very varied. So there is a diversity, which you go back to medieval times. You'd actually have had more of a sense of that, perhaps, than the modern conception of it. So that's a comment. But just as a priest, priests get to do a lot of work with the dying. And there's one other aspect which you didn't mention, but I've heard of it myself, which is the sense of a kind of battle for the soul towards the very end. And also sometimes you talk about a being of light, but sometimes you get this sense of a dark being as well. Is that also something that comes across in these near-death experiences? Thank you.
There are negative near-death experiences. Yeah. They're quite rare. I think I read it's something like 2% or something like that. But as far as the battle for the soul, I'm not sure I've come across that specifically. I mean, it's sort of reflected in the text and ethnographic material when they have, a sort of judgment type scenario.
Thank you very much. Would you join me in thanking Dr. Shushan?